Welcome to Backroom Talk.
Let's talk about exercise selection.
Indeed. I think this is a great topic and an important one to kind of demystify a little bit, because a very common question we get from coaches is, what is the best exercise for blah? So let's begin with assess, don't guess.
We want to have as much exposure to all patterns as possible, right? Because frequency really matters.
By now, you know the answer isn't you should program the back squat for this person and you should program the front squat for this person, because there's so much more nuance to it than that.
To listen to more Backroom Talk, be sure to subscribe. Learn to design personalized programs with the OPEX system of coaching by heading to opexfit.com.
Welcome to another episode of Backroom Talk. I am Georgia, here with Carl. How are you going today, Carl?
I'm not going anywhere, but I'm doing okay.
Okay. I'm going to be going somewhere soon. I'm flying back to Arizona on Saturday. It's the last podcast we're recording remotely. It'll be good to be back in person.
I know I can't, not that I can't wait because I enjoy it, but I can't wait for your accent to go back to your Midwestern Michigan accent that you had a month ago.
That's exactly it.
Sorry, I was kind of giving you a little dig because you said, how are you going today? So you did like the Australian thing. And that's why I said, I'm not going anywhere, but I'm doing well.
You know what? It went straight over my head.
I know. You just went right over that. You're just like, yeah, I don't know what this guy's talking about.
I think I do how you going, like, rather than how you're doing normally, though. So no, I don't.
No, I'm shaking my head. No, I've never heard you say that.
People do make fun of me about it. So I'm a little bit sensitive, but I guess not sensitive enough to have noticed it today.
I like it. You got to keep it rolling. I like it. It's spicy, right? It's a little bit of a change up. It makes you think. It's like, what is she asking me? Is she asking me to leave? Like, I don't understand.
Just get out of here. I'm doing this one alone. Let's get to what the people actually want, which is the conversation around program design and fitness and like all of that good stuff. We'll stop boring you guys with our how we say how is it going or how is it doing, how we greet people. I think that's fairly.
I think everyone just wants to hear about Elon Musk buying Twitter.
You want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Elon Musk bought Twitter. I don't know if we're giving anyone any news.
I don't think,
but yeah, that was crazy, right?
It didn't seem like a thing that would actually happen.
Yeah, when you looked at it was funny because when you looked kind of into the actual proposal that leaked obviously from his side like 2 weeks ago, there's like it's a very official legal doc, and at the end of the doc it just says like Elon Musk's remarks. And he was just like an absolute smartass in like legal terms and bullet form, and essentially just said, I purchased 9.2 or 7%, whatever it was, for this amount. This is what happened to the stocks. He's like, this isn't a threat. It's just reality. But if you refuse this more than fair offer, essentially I'm out and your stocks are going to drop drastically. So it was like funny reading through that. It was like, man, he just strong-armed these guys.
To imagine having the power to be able to strong-arm Twitter is just remarkable.
It's so good. You know what's interesting? Like I was watching something yesterday, and Jen Psaki, like the White House speaker, was at the podium, and it was just mind-blowing that they had a 10-minute conversation on Twitter at the White House. I'm like, obviously that's reality, right? It shouldn't be that mind-blowing, but I'm like, man, who would have thought that at the podium of the White House they'd be discussing politics around Twitter for 10 minutes, going back and forth with an extremely serious face? Because that's the world we live in. But yeah, it was interesting to see that.
It is indeed. But all of this just like, and the proposal that you mentioned from Musk just reminds me of an episode of Succession. Like I feel like that's what this is, right? We're just living that.
Oh yeah. That's a good connection there. I didn't even think about that. It's a great show, by the way.
Great show. Would recommend it to anyone that hasn't seen Succession.
Yeah.
We should probably talk about fitness though, right?
Yeah, unless something else comes to mind, then I'm like, oh, what about this? So I feel like we have to catch up on a lot. We gotta stay relevant here. It's almost like holding up a newspaper in a photo. It's like, guys, I swear this wasn't recorded 6 months ago.
No, we did do a few like preemptive recordings, knowing that I was going to be out of town for a bit, but we're like caught up to date, guys. It's not live time, but we're living in the present, except a week behind because we do record these a week ahead. So.
They don't have to know that. All right, let's talk about exercise selection.
Indeed. I think this is a great topic and an important one to kind of demystify a little bit, because a very common question we get from coaches is, what is the best exercise for blah? And that could be related to like a specific avatar, like what is the best exercise for a tactical athlete, or for a I don't know, bodybuilder, or a masters athlete. Like people are always looking for like that secret sauce of the best exercise to choose. And the reality is, like, is there one answer to that question? No. So what we can provide you guys with, though, is some frameworks to be able to really think critically when it comes to deciding the best exercise for the person in front of you. So surprise, surprise, we're not going to tell you what the best exercise for any one goal is, because it is ultimately so dependent on the person, what they have access to, and all of these considerations that we're going to run through in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Yeah, I think we also need to start with what is, because we've had probably 15 variations of this same conversation over the past few years, but I always think it's nice to kind of revisit, because I think every time we revisit this conversation, we may have evolved thoughts, let's say, right? A few years ago, having this exact same conversation, I think I don't know, like if we were to have this same conversation 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I think I would have different thoughts, actually. Like I would think the conversation is more important, if that makes sense. Like it's not that exercise selection is not important, but I actually don't think it is as important as a lot of people make it out to be. I think it's an important discussion just to get coaches past the idea, right? And understanding, hey, if I choose this versus that, this is the ramifications of it, and I'm like good with choosing this. But those amount of years ago, I would have maybe thought about it a little bit differently, where it was like, I wouldn't have said this is the best exercise for everyone, but I think I would have been more narrow in my views on exercise selection. And not saying like I've evolved and like everyone should evolve with me, or I'm right and everyone should think the way that I think. But I think once coaches kind of get past that idea of like there is one way to do it or two ways of doing it, they're just a lot more comfortable when they sit down and they design training programs for themselves or for their clients. It kind of opens the floodgates a little bit and allows you to kind of get out there and explore with some barriers on either side of you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a place where coaches spend a lot of time and waste a lot of time trying to figure out the best exercise to program for the client that they're designing for inside of Coach RX. And you think about, okay, the amount of time that's being spent on that decision-making process relative to how much it's going to affect the client's results, the client's experience. Like, is this the best use of a ton of energy and brain power, or should we be simplifying this a little bit more so we can put more energy and time into other aspects of coaching? So I completely agree with you, Carl, that choosing the right exercise does get put on a pedestal, but probably in a misguided way, because it's, at the end of the day, if you give someone a front squat and maybe more optimal would have been a goblet squat, is the world going to end? Is it going to necessarily change their entire experience? Like, do you have to go? I agree. I would have had a time where it was like, all right, we've got to go from the goblet squat to the front squat to the back squat. We can't rush into the back squat because they haven't been through this progression. And I think exercise selection and progression, those things like ultimately end up tying together. You can't really separate them, but you can give someone the non-ideal exercise and they can still get a very good training response from that.
Yeah, for sure. Not to stay here before we actually dig into frameworks and stuff like that, but I do think, I don't know, just I think if everyone imagined, the last time they did resistance training, and or think back to the last time they did resistance training and they felt like they got like the right response, right? And I don't mean like physiologically, right? I just mean like the right response in your brain. You know, when you do an exercise and you're just like, that's challenging, but it fucking feels good. You know what I mean? Like that almost like it hit the spot, right? Like that did exactly what I needed it to do. Just think back to that. And it's like, what was the exercise that you did when you felt that thing? I think that's what we need to try to get to with exercise selection with clients, right? It's like feeling that connection to the movement and the contraction that they're performing, whether that is a goblet squat or a front squat or an overhead squat, whatever the hell that is. It's like it hits the spot over and over and over, and the client's like connected to that thing. And it's almost like again, we've had this conversation through a different lens, right? But it's almost like the connection to not only the intention behind the program design and all of that, but the connection to what someone's doing on a day-to-day basis inside of the gym is really important, right? If the idea is to get people fired up to move their bodies and go through some resistance training a few times a week, not saying that you have to, jump through hoops to ensure that your clients are absolutely loving absolutely every contraction they perform in the gym, but if your client is over and over saying, I fucking hate seeing rear foot elevated split squats, and Coach RX, I get like this pit in my stomach. And then when I go to do them, I actually use probably 20 pounds less in load because I just absolutely hate the feeling when I do heavier or the load that you prescribed, right? It's like, I probably just wouldn't do rear foot elevated split squats for that client. You know what I mean? And I think we all have exercises in the back of our minds where we can kind of think about that, right? I think about like heavy deadlifts for myself, right? Like heavy barbell deadlifts, like high intensity. And I'm just like, ugh, I don't want to do those, right? And it's like, if I saw those in my program on a day-to-day basis, like I'd be less inspired to go and do those things as prescribed. So that's kind of where my head is in terms of like the perfect exercise selection. It's the one that the client can perform what we say, right? They're capable of. They can perform it in a safe way, and they get the right response from it, not physiologically, but more like contraction wise and emotionally. It's like, yeah, I fucking enjoyed that.
Absolutely. Well, I think we should give the listeners a starting point to be able to kind of uncover what those exercises are through the frameworks that we're going to discuss. So let's begin with assess, don't guess. Like, guys, if you've been around OPEX, you've heard this plenty of times from us. Assessment is a key pillar inside of the OPEX method and what we teach in the OPEX coaching certificate program. We're not going to run through exactly how to conduct an assessment on this podcast. That would be a much longer conversation, but that is what we do in our education. We teach coaches per pattern how to assess someone's starting point, looking, first with move. What is movement quality like? Looking at some core endurance characteristics. Do they have range of motion that they need to be able to move through these movement patterns? And then as they progress, looking at how that contraction is going from motor control to strength endurance to max contractions, and having some kind of benchmarks along the way to be able to assess that. So CCP is your place if you want to go deep into how assessment connects to exercise selection. And Carl, you've actually done an awesome job in the client module of CCP, connecting even that movement assessment and the faults that show in that movement assessment to where a coach can actually begin in exercise selection to address that fault. And that's just an example of how much individual capabilities, individual weaknesses and limitations will ultimately dictate what is best for that person.
Yeah, definitely. On the assessment side, we won't go deep into it, but it's fairly simple, right? It's like, is someone able to go through that pattern with an adequate range of motion? And it's like, what is an adequate range of motion? It's like, that's going to be determined by the client, right? There has to be objective, like the client can't get past a quarter squat and an air squat. Is that adequate ranges of motion? It's like, no, not relative to this test. So we have to extrapolate those ideas inside of that. And it's like, what do we do in program design because they can only do a quarter squat, right? Like same with all the other patterns. It's like we're just looking at what their capabilities are right now today. And then the next day we're designing a training program that's meeting them where they are inside of those capabilities. And, sometimes the goal is to, increase ranges of motion. Sometimes the goal or the intentions of the program design is just to work right inside of those ranges of motion. So it definitely depends, but yeah, the assessment is just a starting point. So we don't want to give people things that they're not able to do. I mean, I know that's common sense, right? But we don't want to throw, 100-kilo overhead squat in someone's program design if they can't even do an overhead air squat.
For sure. And I mean, it's a pretty common refrain, like there's no bad exercises, just bad applications of exercises. And the overhead squat, I was like thinking to myself of a good example of an exercise someone probably shouldn't do based on assessment. And that's like such an obvious one where the risk is not worth the reward if someone doesn't have adequate stability and mobility built to be able to support a barbell overhead, let alone, what their goal is and whether or not they actually need to do an overhead squat. So we can only answer that question, is an exercise good or bad, if we have a starting point of that assessment. Otherwise, it could be good for the right person. It could be bad for another person. Yeah. I mean, assessment's going to also dictate how much time we spend on different movement patterns, and therefore how much time we need to spend on exercise selection for different movement patterns too, right? Because if we identify that someone needs a ton of single leg work, but they're not going to be doing any like bilateral squatting, our program design, we're going to be looking for lunge exercises, and we're going to stay away from squat based exercises. So it will determine like what that training split ultimately ends up looking like. And then as a step after that, what the actual exercises end up being too.
Yeah, definitely. And it can also give you some insights as well, right? Like, let's say that you have someone that's doing a lunge assessment and you notice that they're not very good at that, right? And you're like, okay, I want to work on the lunge pattern specifically, and I want to do that 3 times a week. And you do that for 3 weeks with that client, and they're just like, gosh, I feel tired. I'm not recovering. My body doesn't feel good. And then you kind of, go back in their program design and you see all of this lunge work, and you see these little like signs of like, that was extremely challenging. That was tough. Right? It's like, you can connect the dots in your head. It's like, oh, coming out of my assessment, I said I was going to focus on the lunge pattern because I really wanted to improve that, but my client isn't recovering on a week-to-week basis. Is it because they have to dig so deep into their nervous system to be able to do that pattern 3 times a week loaded, right? Where I'm just like overtaxing something that they're not even capable of doing. Maybe I just need to pull the reins back a little bit and maybe do that once a week because it's actually challenging for them to recover from. So I think, looking back at doing an assessment and looking back at the results of that assessment, not only in that transition out of the assessment, but just kind of like when things are kind of weird and you're just like, oh man, I need more data. I don't know why they're feeling this way. And your intuition isn't able to give you those answers. It's like the assessment is a great place to go back and just review your notes on that assessment.
Definitely. So we assess, don't guess. That would really be the starting point for, any program design and all aspects and all strategies that go into program design, not just exercise selection. Anything else to add on assessment that you think coaches should keep in mind?
No, just do it. Do it as often as needed is the only thing I would say, right? I know we usually lay out, assess beginners very often, assess intermediates a little bit less often, and assess advanced clients seldomly. But if you're trying to change something, don't be afraid to reassess that thing frequently, even with advanced clients. If you're intentionally trying to change it and you're implementing things in their program design and an exercise selection that is intended to change that thing, just because we said you want to assess an advanced client seldomly doesn't mean that you have to wait 8 months to reassess that thing that you're working on. So don't be afraid to assess your clients. We're talking about movement assessments or just it doesn't have to be a movement screen, right? Just like assessing them on the floor through patterns of movement in from a week to week basis. And it's like, how is this week's squatting pattern compare to last week's or 2 weeks ago. It doesn't always have to be an intentional, okay, now we're coming in with our clipboard and we're doing the overhead air squat and then we're doing that. It doesn't always have to be that. ABA, always be assessing.
Always be assessing. Need a t-shirt.
It took me a
with
second.
that.
I was going to say ABS. I don't know why. ABS came to mind. I don't know. Maybe it's the S is an assessment.
Yeah, always be assessing.
Always be assessing.
There we go. Well, next consideration or next framework for exercise selection would be looking at the life gain chart that we lay out again inside of CCP. This connects pretty nicely to a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago on creating smarter splits, because so much of designing splits and picking the patterns that go inside of those splits is relative to where someone sits on that life gain framework. So are they novice, intermediate, advanced, master, grandmaster? That's going to determine one of the factors, at least, that determines the right plan or the right split for that client. So if you're interested in a deep dive on training splits, I would recommend going back to that conversation. So not to like reiterate everything we said there, Carl, but any kind of key considerations for life gain and how it will impact exercise selection?
No, not really. I would just refer back to that conversation because it was fairly extensive. But to kind of wrap it up, it's just, someone's experience, and this will connect to what we're going to discuss next, but someone's experience is going to dictate the type of exercises that they're doing or the intentions behind the types of exercises that they're doing. And we'll get into the motor control, strength, endurance, max contraction framework in a second here. But just it has to be really obvious, right? It's like you're not loading up a novice client with 115% of their 1 rep max and trying to get them to bench press, right? Like that's obvious. Everyone listening to this knows that, right? But it's like you still see it, right? You still see it. So I think that's worth reiterating. Understand where someone is, and that's going to influence the type of training they're going to be doing, their splits, and the exercises that are going to go inside of that.
Absolutely. And just for a quick hit on it. So like novice, we would be looking at a full body split. So they're hitting all movement patterns and exercises from each in a training day. Intermediate would be hitting like an upper lower split. And then advanced would be getting more isolated.
Yep. You don't have to, but those are almost like it releases those options, right? Like principally. So novice, yes, just like you said, Georgia, it's like full body. But when you go to intermediate, you don't have to do upper lower. You can still do full body all the way through advanced. But what Georgia was laying out is just like maybe don't start with an isolated split and just do biceps on Mondays with a novice client, because that client needs to learn all movement patterns. So they should be doing all movement patterns on a daily basis.
For sure. Again, guys, go back, listen to that episode from 2 weeks ago. So let's move on, because it connects so nicely to that life gain framework, the actual contraction progression and the types of contractions that we would program, because ultimately like that response, that contraction response that we want is going to be one of the factors that dictates the exercise we're going to prescribe. And you kind of hit on how that is the goal earlier on in the conversation when we were starting it, Carl. Like you want it just to feel right. You want it to hit the spot. We have to know what spot we're trying to hit though when we are programming. And that is, do we want motor control as that spot, that scratch that we're itching? Do we want strength endurance, or do we want max contractions? So those are our 3 options that we can be searching for and seeking for when we're sitting down to write our program out.
Yeah, and that connects really nicely to the splits that we were just discussing, right? It's like, if the goal is to gain motor control, right, across all patterns, we want to have as much exposure to all patterns as possible, right? Because frequency really matters. So we want to be doing all of those things, right? Moving over to strength endurance and, the idea behind strength endurance. So I don't want to use the terms yet, but the idea behind strength endurance is now we've gained motor control. We have motor control in a particular pattern. Now it's like, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper and let's challenge the motor control that we gained in the previous few cycles, right? So, we might be doing some really slow and controlled contractions. Time under tension is really high. we've gathered motor control, and then we move into that next phase of training, and we're focusing on strength endurance. So those reps are a little bit faster. Time under tension is still high, right? We're still doing really high volume training, or relatively high volume training. And we're just ensuring that we're not pushing it to the limits to break down the motor control that we gained, right? Or the motor learning, the patterns that we learned to move through really, really efficiently, but we're challenging the efficiency. So just think about someone, and this is more of a, I'm going to use this example because I think people can kind of like picture it in their heads, but it's not the best example. This shouldn't be like the goal. But just think about you taking someone through a squat motor control cycle or a few cycles, and you're like, boom, okay, they gained that. And maybe you're doing some dumbbell front squats, maybe some goblet squats, maybe some barbell back squats, whatever the case was. And you were doing those things really slow and controlled, and positions were like perfect all the way through. And, when positions started to break down, you kind of wrapped it up. And they did that for an amount of time, and you took them through progression, whatever progression meant for them. And then you move into this next phase of training, and it's strength endurance, right? And again, this isn't an awesome example in terms of like, you need to go from this to that. But now think about doing high volume sets of like heavy wall balls, right? Or even like heavy front rack med ball squats, right? And you're like, okay, we were doing high time under tension, really controlled. Everything was really good in the previous cycle. Now the intentions here is just to go a little bit faster. And I want you to stop before you lose great technique. And you start like talking your client through the way that this should feel relative to the way that the previous cycle felt. Previous cycle, it was like, it wasn't that metabolic, right? It was slow. You kind of felt it in the quads. There was like some core stuff happening, some lower back stuff happening, stabilizing the barbell as you were going up and down through the back squat. But by the time you finished that thing, it was just like your nervous system was okay. It was like a muscular response that you had. You needed a bunch of rest, and then you went back and you did that thing. Now in strength endurance, you're going to get to that feeling that you had at rep 8, 9, and 10. You're going to get to that a lot faster in strength endurance, right? So you might be doing 20 reps instead of 8, 9, or 10 reps, but the time under tension is the same, but the tempo is like cut in half. So you're just moving through that squat over and over and over and over and over and over again. And maybe you get to rep 18 or 19, and like the chest starts to fall, and you just drop the ball, or you drop the kettlebell, and it's like, okay, I'm going to stop. I'm recovered. I'm going to do that thing again. So motor control and the way that it could feel metabolically is actually very similar to the way that strength endurance exercises would feel, or the intention of strength endurance would feel. You just get there a lot quicker. So yeah, we kind of walk through that on CCP calls. I'm like, what is the difference in feeling? And what we land on, it's like, it actually feels the same. You just get there a lot quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just went off on a rant there, because
No, all good.
ask, yeah, no, people usually ask like, what the hell is strength endurance? And that's actually a challenging one to lay out there with a quick definition.
Yeah, no, great run through there. And especially that difference between motor control and strength endurance. I want to spend just like a second on max contractions. And because I think that's a really obvious place where exercise selection is going to matter a lot around that like contraction type progression. I think you can get away with more when it comes to the actual exercise you're selecting for motor control and strength endurance. Like you can, take it with a grain of salt. There are some things you shouldn't program for motor control dose. There are some things you probably aren't going to program for a strength endurance dose, but max contraction gets like very specific because you need that really heavy, intense nervous system taxing type response. And there are only like certain implements and certain exercises that can deliver that. So do you agree that that's where you have to get more dialed in with exercise selection, Carl, compared to the others?
Yeah, absolutely. Your options are extremely limited there, right? Because if we're looking at this from if we were to call like if we were to say like, hey, we need a global max contraction response throughout the entire body, yeah, it kind of opens up, right? But if we're like, we need a squat max contraction response, now it gets extremely limited, right? And the reason why I say that, right, it's like I've had the question before. It's like, why can't we do max contractions with kettlebells in the squat pattern? And it's like, what would the limiter be, right? Would the limiter be how the heck you're gonna hold that kettlebell, or the limiter be the nervous system, the quads, the glutes? And it's like, yeah, it's obviously the way that you would hold that kettlebell. Obviously, there's some there's some one-offs. Maybe you have someone that's extremely imbalanced and their upper body is unbelievably strong, and they have like a like the I miss leg day meme, like they might look like that person. So maybe they could do it, but most people, it's very challenging, right? It's very challenging to get a max contraction response off of a kettlebell in the squat pattern. And then, we can kind of look at all the other implements, and it's like, nope, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. So our options are fairly limited. We can jump into a machine and we can elicit that response. We could throw a barbell on our backs, obviously, and elicit that response. We might be able to use some odd object implements to elicit that response, but yeah, we're not having like max contraction banded squats, right? Like a 1 rep max band squat, or a 1 RM kettlebell goblet squat, right? So yeah, very, very limited.
Definitely. Just to speak to a personal experience around that, and not so much max contraction, but even strength endurance, right? If you're trying to load strength endurance on the heavier side for that squat pattern, for the bend pattern, and you don't have access to a barbell, a machine, or perhaps an odd object, it's really hard. I was at a hotel gym and we had dumbbells, kettlebells, and cables and not much else. And it was pretty good setup, right? But no barbells, no like real machines for lower body. And I was doing a 6, 12, 25 program. So the 6 reps, fairly heavy, 12 reps, lighter, 25 reps, really light. And finding a heavy 6 reps of a squat with only dumbbells or kettlebells was impossible. That's
when you just got to go like 8-1x1 tempo for 6 reps.
Exactly. Well, I had dumbbells on my shoulders for a front rack, and I had to have my husband pass them to me because I couldn't clean them up, which I feel like if you can't clean the dumbbells yourself, you shouldn't be lifting them. Like that should probably be a rule. You've got to be able to get the equipment in place yourself. Otherwise, you're not touching the equipment. And it was like this terrifying thing of like trying to lower them down slow enough so as not to just like totally blow myself in the knee with the dumbbell coming down. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you need a barbell if you want like a heavy 6 on a squat.
Yeah. Oh man, that's good. Yeah, I've been in that situation many of times where it's like, I want to do something tough, but it's like there's nothing around me that can make it tough. That's when you just do like isometric protocols where you just like get under something and just like drive as hard as you can for 8 seconds, and that's like your max contraction.
So we've chatted through contraction progression a little bit. So again, the motor control, strength endurance, max contractions. Anything else to add there as it relates to exercise selection, Carl, before we move on?
No, I think we'll uncover some things as we move forward here.
Definitely. Well, next one would be concurrent considerations. So we're kind of looking at the strength continuum here and exercise selection inside of that. So if we're thinking about that strength continuum, on one end, we have absolute speed. So exercises that are going to allow us to move as fast as possible. And that's pretty limited, right? You're sprinting. There's maybe a couple other things in there, but absolute speed exercises on the one end. We have absolute strength on the other end, where we're eliciting that kind of max contraction, tough response, moving heavy loads slowly on the other end of that spectrum. And then in between, as we move from, let's start with absolute strength. So as we move from absolute strength, we get to strength speed. So now we're moving heavy-ish loads quickly. So think about like a clean or a snatch. And then we move next to that, and then we have speed strength. So we could be doing touch and go power cleans at a light load. We could be doing loaded throws, like a med ball throw, before we get to, again, that absolute speed on the other side. So we've got that continuum to think about. And as we're selecting exercises, deciding what dose we want to get from them, we have to make that deliberate choice of which one are we going to pick from and how are we going to then order that in a training session as well.
Yeah, for most people, gosh, just stay in absolute strength. Yeah, just stay in absolute strength. Just because the other things exist, I think a lot of people think that they have to do them, and that's definitely not the case. You could be extremely fit, extremely healthy, extremely strong, extremely whatever the heck you want to be without doing strength, speed, strength, and absolute speed activity. But I think we have to talk about them because they're a part of it, right? So even when we put this class together, that the exercise selection class, we're like, do we even include those? And it was like, yeah, we have to have a conversation on them because they exist and they're inside of people's heads. So let's give people some context and then say, like, you probably don't need to do them, but if you did want to do them, this is how it lay out inside of a session. And the thing that grinds my gears is when people call speed strength speed. I see that so often. There's a difference between speed strength and strength speed. I'm not even going anywhere with that. I just wanted to say that because as you walked through that, Georgia, I was like, because I had that image on the board and I was like, did I do that backwards? But I put absolute speed down to absolute strength. And I was like, did I just make the mistake that I hate the most? Luckily I didn't. But I don't know, that was the first thing that came to my head to my head when you were walking through that. But yeah, let's stay in absolute strength. Let's when we talk about the max contraction strength endurance, or sorry, motor control strength endurance max contraction continuum, that's all inside of absolute strength, right? Like we're not doing motor control for the touch and go power snatch, right? Like there's no such thing. So we're kind of sitting inside of that absolute strength when we talk about those things. So if you are one of those people that want to go down the continuum, principally, you should actually master every pattern from motor control all the way down to max contraction before you even do a touch and go power snatch.
Why is that?
Because you need to be able to move through all patterns of movement when you get to, because if we were to break down, and we've gone through this, right? This like, what pattern is a snatch, right? And we get to like, it's actually every pattern, right? It's like, we're using the core, we're bending, it's a push pattern, it's a squat if we go through the entirety of it. If we say we're doing a split snatch, it's also a lunge, right? So it's like, those movements include almost all patterns of movement. And if you can't move through those patterns slow and controlled, you probably shouldn't be moving through them loaded and dynamically.
Definitely. And I mean, this is a thing that grinds my gears, but we have to be strong enough if we're going to increase power, right? Like the intention of programming something like a clean or a snatch is likely to increase power for that individual if we're programming strength speed exercises. But like, how many kids have you seen in the weight room who are jumping right to them and can't even back squat their own body weight or deadlift their own body weight? And you just like think about the like risks and rewards for exercises like that. And then how much benefit they could get from in power production from just like getting stronger in their deadlift or their back squat. And you're just leaving so much on the table if you're not, I don't want to say maxing out absolute strength first, but if you're not developing a good base of absolute strength first.
Yeah, definitely. And let's be realistic, right? It's like it's okay to do those things, but the intentions behind doing them, because some people just find it fun to move a barbell overhead, right? And it's like, who are we to say like, no, you can't move a barbell overhead until you go through 8 years of this contraction continuum across all patterns? It's like, no, we're not saying that, but what we're saying is if you're trying to do those movements and you're trying to, let's just call it like max out, or you're trying to get to your maximum physical potential in those movements and you're going through this like program that's laying out percentages and stuff like that, it's like, yeah, we'd have a problem with that. But if you're just like, I'm just doing some like some really light muscle snatches and I'm just getting under and I'm practicing and it's like I'm just working on skills, it's like, yeah, that's cool, man. Like that's okay. The issue is when you start to really load that thing up and you're like, I need to max out my snatch. And it's like, but you can't even squat, you can't pull, you can't push, right? It's like, that's all we're saying. We're not saying like, you need to throw the barbell away and never touch it unless you've gone through that progression. But just be realistic with the intentions behind doing those exercises. And I think that's where you're coming from with like kids in the weight room trying to develop power through those exercises. It's like, no, you're not going to do that. You're actually just wasting your time. If you're trying to develop skills, movement, balance, right? Things like that. It's like, cool. Yeah, do that stuff, but just be really clear on what it's going to lead to. You're not going to be faster because you're snatching 40 pounds. Like that's just not going to happen, right? No offense to people that snatch 40 pounds.
I can snatch more than 40 pounds. I
Yes.
So we're all good. Intentions matter, and just being honest and upfront about what you're trying to get from a specific exercise really does matter. And the concurrent considerations when it comes to that strength continuum is a place where I think people get a little muddy with what their intention and their reason for choosing an exercise actually is. I want to add like one more thing on the strength continuum that I found really helpful. It's actually something James told me in the gym years ago. I was in like doing some like med ball throws against the wall and just kind of like figuring it out and trying to determine what the best load was for me to perform that exercise to get a speed strength response from it. And it sounds like so simple, but he was like, don't think about the load you're using. Don't think about the exercise specifically that you're doing so much, to think about how fast you're moving, to think about what that like response is, think about how fast you're recruiting, and let that dictate what you go and grab, the weight of the med ball you go and grab. And that applies across the continuum, right? Like whether you're trying to get that absolute strength response, whether you're getting strength, speed strength, or absolute speed, at the end of the day, that speed of contraction is the thing that matters. It's not necessarily one exercise or like one load or intensity that's going to dictate where it sits. I could go through the action of throwing a med ball against the wall, and it would probably be like it would be slow. It would be an absolute strength contraction, for lack of a better example, right? I could just hold the ball, rotate, turn my hips, and like extend my arms, and I wouldn't get that speed strength response. So just making sure, I don't know if this made sense, but it made so much sense to me when James ran me through it, but just making sure the load and the exercise you're picking are allowing you to move at the speed you need to move to get that correct response.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it's like, if we laid out the continuum in front of us and we had absolute strength on the left and absolute speed was on the right, if we were to like measure how fast we're moving from absolute strength all the way to absolute speed, let's say we're using a pattern that looked the same, right? Like let's say it was a squat pattern that we were using. And for absolute strength, it was a back squat, right? And then we moved into strength speed, and then it was a thruster, right? And then for strength speed, it was a thruster. And then for speed strength, it was a rebounding depth jump, right? And then for absolute speed, it was like sprinting or going really hard on a bike, right? You can kind of see in that pattern that it went from slow to fast. So James saying that to you, he was probably thinking like, is this faster than the last thing that you did, right? Is this faster than the strength speed stuff that you just finished doing, right? So that's a very simple but interesting way to look at it. Not interesting, it should be obvious, right? But it's a helpful way to look at it.
Yeah, you just need those simple reminders sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So last framework that we would consider when we're thinking about exercise selection, and I say last one for this conversation, there's probably a ton of other things we haven't hit on today that actually ultimately dictate exercise selection, but exercise intention and the learn, grow, express framework are a really helpful way of classifying what you want. And again, what that dose is you're looking for from training for that individual. And then inside of that, what exercises, pieces of equipment you might be able to pull from to get one of those three responses or intention. So could you explain what learn, grow, express mean?
Yeah, definitely. So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, this is a framework that we laid out in our exercise selection class that's in LearnRx. And we just wanted to use some different language around around contractions that had to do with the intention or the intent of the exercise or the cycle that we're doing, right? So learn, that's obvious, right? It's like we're learning to do the movement. So when we break that down, it's like movements are slow, they're controlled. Again, time under tension is high, like we just talked about. We don't want to get out of positions in those, right? And loads, because they're slow, they're controlled, time under tension is high, we want to keep quality absolutely perfect. Loads are just going to be relatively low, right, for the individual. So that's learning, right? We're learning to do something. So that can be a contraction or a skill, that could be anything, right? But inside of that framework, inside of that intention, we're thinking about, I need to learn this thing, I need to learn this pattern of movement. Then we move to the grow piece. And when we talk about grow, we're talking about growing the skill, right? Growing the pattern. I know there's a lot of things inside of that. It's like, oh, well, it could be also be used to grow muscle, right? Like hypertrophy training can actually sit inside of here. Yes, of course, right? If we're trying to maximize the skill in terms of building better strength endurance in the pull pattern, it's like that would actually sit inside of the grow piece as well. So, we're just getting a little bit faster, right? So speed is increasing. Loads are going to go up a little bit because we're not so slow and controlled. So that barrier of one rep taking us 6 seconds to get through, that's now removed, and maybe it's taking us 2 or 3 seconds to get through it. Volume is still high, right? And I just had that term like pump, right? Like you feel like that pump, or you feel that metabolic response when you're inside of this grow phase. And then finally express, that's just like the highest levels of expression, right? So we could just call that, lifting really heavy loads. So it doesn't necessarily have to be max contractions, right? Like we could hit heavy fives inside of this express framework, but you're just like really lighting up that light bulb, right? So those contractions are controlled. Loads are obviously really, really high. We have to consider nervous system as being the thing that we need to recover from on a session by session basis, which is challenging for some people because they don't feel, quote unquote, feel like they got a lot from that training session afterwards, right? But if they hit it in its truest intention, and they went and like took an HRV test, they would actually see like, oh man, that was actually a very beneficial nervous system response training session. So that's what we're looking at there. And it's like the less is more moniker really lives inside of this express piece. So volume is lower. We're doing less total work, but we're the quality and the expression inside of that work is really, really high.
Definitely. I mean, when you're clear on that intention, it does make it much easier to then decide, okay, what are we putting inside of the program? So let's take, for example, the push pattern. So in Learn, we might identify that we are going to do a single arm dumbbell bench press and really focus on, moving through range of motion, understanding what's happening as we lower that dumbbell towards us, extend our arm back up. We get into grow, and maybe now we're doing dumbbell bench press with both arms, and we're getting more of that, like you said, Carl, kind of pump response versus just organizing our brain around like stabilizing our core on one side to be able to hold the dumbbell on the other. That's happening in that Learn phase. We get into express. Are we really going to do like a single arm dumbbell bench press in express with our shoulders on a Swiss ball? Probably not, because we're not going to be able to get that nervous system taxing response that we need. So now we're probably going for a close grip bench press or a bench press with barbell, and letting that again guide our exercise selection.
Yeah, definitely. And, just kind of more clarifying, that initial point on like, what could be inside of each of those per pattern. If we did have something like the squat pattern, right? We have to think about what would be inside of, I guess it's more beneficial to think about what would not be inside of each one of those pieces, right? So if I'm looking to learn the squat pattern, I might not be doing a bunch of dumbbell loaded squats. I might not be doing a bunch of kettlebell loaded squats, barbell squats, odd object squats, right? I might not be doing compound movements. I might be doing a lot of body weight stuff, right? And just think about this as like, we took a client through an assessment and they just can't squat, right? Like they can't go through the pattern effectively. That could be a range of motion thing. That could be a mobility thing. That could be anything, right? Like, or it could just be a brain thing where they just haven't done the movement before. So we're probably doing a bunch of body weight squats. We're probably doing some assisted squats. We're squatting to a target. We're using an implement to do some counterbalance squats. We might be doing some R&T versions of squats. We might be utilizing a machine, right? Like we might be putting that client on a hack squat machine, a Smith machine, things like that to get to those fullest ranges of motion, to really feel what it's like to be inside of or at the bottom of a squat. We might be doing some cable variations of the squat. We might have some prescribed squat mobility. If it was like, yeah, it's a mobility thing, and me just like loading you isn't going to fix that, right? Or me just doing a bunch of air squats isn't going to fix that. Like I can target exactly what the heck the deal is here. Or it's just a bunch of squat accessory movements, right? So if we could look at that pattern by pattern, where it's like, okay, what's in that learn framework? Like what exercises are in that learn framework? What exercises are in that grow framework? And what exercises are in that express framework? I think that'll make a lot more sense. And then understand when clients go to learn, grow, and express, and why they're in learn, grow, and express.
There could be multiple of those intentions happening in like one day's training as well, right, Carl? Like let's say we are talking about an advanced individual who can do motor control, strength, endurance, and max contractions. You may have exercises programmed that fit into all of those buckets. Is that fair to say?
Inside of a single training session, you mean?
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, they can be. I think I would just be, because I'm thinking, right, because when I think like, okay, we need to learn something, I'm thinking about the things that might take away from me learning that, right? So for instance, I guess when you first said that, Georgia, my head went to like, can someone learn how to squat while maxing out on their bench press? Technically, maybe, right? But I'm just thinking about like the recovery process and what's happening. And not to overcomplicate it, because I think it can be done, right? But if we were to lay out like going back to our conversation 2 weeks ago on split training splits, right? I'd be fairly targeted on overall intentions of a training split, and I would just put like all of those intentions inside of that, right? So if a client learning how to squat was the most important thing, I would actually just be going through high volume or high time under tension training across the board while doing more of the squat, right? So to answer your question, yeah, it can be done, but I think I'd look at the overall intention of the design. I think there's a lot of carryover between learn and grow, not a lot of carryover between learn and express, though, because if
that's
we're really
fair.
trying to express something, because the nervous system is so taxed through really tough, intense compound movements, we might go through some really high quality squat movements in A, and then because we're going through like 8 sets of doubles on the bench press in B, we might actually remove the things that we gain from A, from a neurological level, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if you kept those things on separate days throughout a week, like if you're doing some really tough deadlifting on a Monday and then a Tuesday, you're coming in and you're trying to improve your, learning on the dip, for example.
Yeah.
You're probably still pretty fatigued and not at your sharpest and capable of learning and taking on new movements on that Tuesday.
Yeah, but I say that with caution, though, right? Like I say that with caution because it's like what I just walked through is actually too complicated, right? It's like we shouldn't even have to think that far, right? It's like, sometimes on a Sunday I'll do a 3-hour hike, and then on Monday I'll squat heavy. And you know what I feel on Monday? I feel fine on Monday, right? It's like, why is that? It's like, because going on a 3-hour hike is like nothing to my legs, right? So it's like, I don't want to just bucket and say like, oh, but if you're working on squatting, you can't bench heavy, right? As I was saying that, George, I was kind of like thinking through that. And by the time I got to the tail end of that response, I was like, I actually don't agree with what I just said because it was too complex, right? Because you said it's an advanced person. So I think it's okay to play around with things safely, right? It's like play around with physical expression and just see what happens. So I don't want to be super dogmatic and say, don't do that because it doesn't fit within the framework, right? I think that's kind of dumb, especially with someone that has a ton of experience in physical expression. I don't think we actually need to think about, you know, practicing something in A and then expressing something in B. I don't think we need to think too deep into that if it's not a novice person that just needs to learn to move their bodies. So sorry, I kind of went back and forth on that one, but yeah, that's kind of where my head is with like exercise selection and how complex it can be. And I just don't think it needs to be that complex. I think there needs to be good frameworks and principles behind it. But people need to know when they're going outside of those frameworks and principles and know when to rein it back if it doesn't work. What we don't want to do is lead a bunch of coaches astray and say, go do whatever the hell you want to do. Right. It's like, yeah, go and mess around, right? Do it safely, see what you and your clients can recover from. Again, do it safely. And when something doesn't go the way that you want it to go, look back at the principles and say, where did I lead myself astray? Or it might not even be astray. It's like, where did I intentionally leave those principles to kind of just experiment? I think that's okay.
For sure. And I mean, like, let's be real. We're not talking about exercise selection for max physical potential in one sport or anything like that. We're having a conversation about exercise selection for people who are doing fitness to, support life and vitality and have great health and everything that goes along with that. So it does get a little bit more complex if you're talking about exercise selection for like sport, especially if that sport actually contains the exercises, right? So weightlifting, powerlifting, if we're talking about CrossFit, like, yes, there are certain exercises you should and should not be doing. Certain amounts of those exercises you should or should not be doing. You're probably going to want to worry about interfering with expression of a squat for a power lifter by other things you're doing in design. But we're not talking about those folks.
Yeah, let's just get fucking people lifting weights and moving every day, guys. If we could do that, who cares? Like, do whatever. Yeah, do whatever, right? Like, go through movements in the gym that they're capable of. Yeah, we're trying to solve problems that aren't really problems, right? Like this whole idea of like figuring out the best exercise selection. And that's not what we're trying to do here. We made that really clear at the top, but the idea of trying to like really dig into the nuances for the 99% of people around the world in terms of what the best exercise selection is not the fight we need to fight. The fight that we need to fight as coaches is just to get people active, right? It's like, gosh, there's so many unhealthy people that aren't doing anything about it right now. I think the biggest impact that we could all have is to coach and inspire those people to just move and lift some weights on a daily basis. I think we'll see a ton of success if we're able to get people to do that and to do it consistently, no matter what the hell they're doing in their exercise selection.
Absolutely, Carl. And I do just want to say, like, it's a little easier to say that, to really lean on that simplicity piece once you have a little bit more experience under your belt and you've done the work you need to do to understand the details, so that you can then zoom out and be, again, like a little bit more reductionist with how you're approaching exercise selection. So for a coach that's listening to this being like, yeah, but I still don't know what exercise to program, we have those conversations in CCP, right? And by now, the answer isn't you should program the back squat for this person and you should program the front squat for this person, because there's so much more nuance to it than that. But there absolutely is conversation around how you can arrive at the right answer. That's just going to become more intuitive over time. So you're going to spend less time actually having to go through that decision-making process as you develop as a coach, as you kind of internalize these learn, grow, express frameworks and all of these ideas. So it's okay if it feels a little bit harder on the front end, but what we do and what we really try and emphasize is how you can take good understanding, do the work on the front end as a coach to understand the science and the principles. And then you are really going to be able to simplify that process when it comes to actually implementing it and being in the trenches working with people. So that is the intention of the coaching certificate program, CCP, to equip coaches to be able to simplify that coaching process, to have more confidence in like, okay, I'm choosing to do a dumbbell front squat for this reason. I know why. And I'm also not spending 20 minutes deciding to do that dumbbell front squat. Is that fair to say, Carl?
Oh gosh, for sure. I mean, man, and we actually talk about this in the tail end of CCP quite often, as like a marker of success is, we hope that you guys over the past 11, 12 weeks have gone through the process that it takes a lot of coaches a decade to go through. And that process is coming in, not knowing, right? Learning a bunch of stuff. And then by the time you finish, you're like, I just downloaded so much information in my brain and I learned how to fucking simplify all of it. Right. But you can't simplify what you don't know. Right.
Yeah.
Like that's reality. And, the client doesn't have to know everything that you know either. Right. So I guess that's where I'm getting to, right. It's like the client just needs to, like me saying, hey, forget everything, right? Forget everything. Just get your clients doing resistance training a few times a week and doing, just moving their body every single day. And it's like, but knowing why they're doing it, the intentions behind it, and where they're going in resistance and all of that, like it should come off so simple, but there's so much behind it, right? Who was it that took the, gosh, it was an artist. Sean mentioned it on our gym's call today. It wasn't Picasso. He took a piece of paper. Someone asked him, hey, can you paint something for me? And he says, sure. He takes a piece of paper, he paints this thing in 5 or 15 minutes or something like that and says, okay, it's going to be $5,000. Right. And the person's like, but wait, like it just took you 15 minutes to do that. How is that worth $5,000? And his answer is like, you didn't pay for the 15 minutes of me doing that. Yes, it looked very simple, but what you paid for was the 25 years of training and education that it took me to be able to paint that picture for you. And the person's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's definitely worth $5,000. Don't know how true that story is, but it makes sense, right? It makes a lot of sense, right? So it's like, let's be able to paint that picture in 5 minutes for clients. And there's a lot of knowledge inside of that picture. But on the surface, it's like, there's like beauty in the simplicity of it. I think that's a beautiful thing to see play out.
That was a great little story. Thank you for sharing that, Carl.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I don't know if it's true, so we need to fact check myself, but if it doesn't matter if it's true or not, it may, like, you get where I was going with that thing, right?
We did indeed. Well, I just want to give a nice little reminder to everyone that we have CCP enrollment going on at the moment for our July cohort. So if it's been something you've been thinking about, we would absolutely love to have you on board. There'll be a link in the description to click and join that cohort. And gosh, what you're going to get out of that thing, like, it's so tempting to say you're going to be able to write smarter programs. You're going to be a smarter coach. But I think the most important takeaway is that you're going to come out the other side and be able to simplify what you've learned and do it in a much more efficient manner and really feel confident that you understand and know why you're doing what you're doing, right? You're going to pick exercises not just because you saw them on Instagram and they look fun and they look cool. You're really going to understand like what the intention is behind them. If you go ahead and you program that speed strength exercise for a client, it's going to be for a damn good reason. So guys, join us in CCP. We'll help you understand the why behind it and then how to implement it in a really simple and effective way.
Definitely.
And leave us a review, guys, on the podcast. Drop a review, like, and subscribe on YouTube. Just asking a lot from you today. Thanks for the chat, Carl.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.